thank you all for coming. It's nice and cool in here. At least a little cooler than outside. I'm Matthew Goulet, I'm the Executive Director. We are thrilled to have you. I know it's a good presentation because I've seen it before, or at least maybe a version of it before. So I know you won't be disappointed. We started thinking about the trees as we were in the pandemic and during the ice storm. I think everyone right after really thought about the trees, but we weren't open yet. We weren't planning art fair. About a year ago, we started planning art fair. The city has a new land or park management plan, which was a collective and inclusive effort, years of thinking how to better manage the parks, including Bush Park. And at the top of their list was celebrating the Kalapuyan culture and history, and really protecting the biodiversity and the plant life, and here in particular, the white oaks. So we started planning art fair with that in mind, and we started thinking what sort of exhibitions could we have in here to highlight the oaks and to help people understand why we're changing our footprint, which was mostly well received, but not entirely well received. Most people sent sort of thank you for protecting the trees during art fair emails. But a few sent, I wouldn't call it hate mail, but it wasn't friendly mail. But that's all right. I think we could next year, with the new footprint, actually explain even more why we moved and why the footprint matters. The good news is that this year's art fair, I think, incurred, as per the city's feedback, almost no damage to the trees. We knocked off a few sprinkler heads, but they're like $4 each, so we can, I think, handle those. But what was interesting to me, was that I sort of started thinking about the trees really in like a, how do we protect them during art fair? How do we do what the city says we need to do and what the research says we need to do? And over the course of the year, I think I kind of fell in love with the trees. And these three professors helped me a little bit. Getting to know the city folks who work here. Brian Smith, there's a tree that I think we'll talk about. There's a slice of it on one of these columns. It's 367 or 65 years old, which is like a wow, moment. So it, for me, has really become both something that we should do and something that feels really wonderful to do. And I think this is a great show. We've gotten great feedback. We had some youth groups in last couple of weeks, and they love making leaves, putting leaves on the tree. So that was one of your great ideas. They're very nice to each other. One of them had credit for it, but they're probably still
we just can't remember.
So, three Willamette professors, David, Karen, and Joe. I think I've seen a couple of times over the years. I presume they work together in many ways, but I don't know if they've ever made an art project together. So without further ado, welcome and thank you.
Now, do you want me to use the microphone? Is that okay? All right.
You can move the mic anywhere you want.
Okay, I'm going to move it closer to where I have to press the button. And then I'm going to try not to share things. Second. This is why I go first.
All right, how's that?
Good.
Okay, let me know if I drift away from the microphone. Well, thanks, Matt, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the Salem Art Association for hosting this show. It's been really, really fun to put together and to take was essentially, scientific research and put it in an art exhibition, along with Carolyn's beautiful, beautiful artwork depicting many of the oak trees in the park. The structure of this talk will be an introduction in which we review the exhibit a little bit, so all the words on the wall, which I'm not assuming everybody's read every one of, so you'll get the gist of it. And then Joe and Dave are going to talk about some of the additional work that they've done since we've mounted this exhibit. And we'll wrap up with some thoughts that we have about the future, and there'll be a Q&A. And we're going to zip back and forth and do different slides. So I'm going to turn this over to Joe now.
And I'll try not to trip on the cords as I'm doing this, right? This is going to be a bit of a logistics issue here too.
Some folks are asking for the lights to go down.
Oh, okay. That's perfectly fine. The large old oaks here at Bush Pastures Park, as well as those in the Sparks parking lot at Willamette University, where we work, are really the living legacies of the indigenous communities of the Willamette Valley. As researchers from Willamette University, we acknowledge our institution's history is deeply tied and interwoven with the earliest colonial actions that harmed the local indigenous people and destroyed the traditional patterns of ecological management that cultivated an open savanna landscape that was rich with food like the camas bulbs that are pictured here as well. Those indigenous communities today are represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. We know that a tree like the one pictured here on the screen has been a witness to their families for potentially 15 or more generations, and that this place that we love has been their home for time immemorial. The star of today's show is the iconic Oregon white oak. This oak species is actually native to the Pacific Northwest, as you can see from the range map on the bottom left. It often grows to be 300 or 400 years old and occurs in mixed forests, open woodlands, and savannas, as well as solitary individuals in agricultural fields. It anchors a habitat that is home to hundreds of different species of animals and plants. The oaks themselves are estimated to provide habitat for over 500 different species of plants, animals, and fungi. The Oregon white oak's story actually starts 18,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, as you can kind of see on the timeline in the bottom right-hand corner. As temperatures warmed and the climate dried, coniferous species were replaced on the landscape by the oak woodlands and prairies, which became well established by about 8,000 years ago. It is one of two native oaks in Oregon and is easily identified by its leaves with its rounded lobes and also by the rough gray bark. With the arrival of European colonists in the Willamette Valley in the mid-1800s, all this starts to change. Within about 150 years of their arrival, the natural and cultural landscape that had persisted for millennia all but disappeared as a result of the genocide of the indigenous people and the conversion of oak habitat to agriculture, conifer plantations, and urban areas. These maps on the right actually provide a stark visualization of our continued presence on this landscape. Less than 10% of the oak habitat that existed prior to European colonization remains today. To be clear, oaks themselves are not in danger of going extinct, but its habitat and the natural and cultural communities of which they are part are. Dave is going to now take over and describe a little bit more about the specialness of the oaks.
I like birds. Many of you like birds. Some of you don't like birds. That's okay. When Joe was talking about that shift in the last 150 years of the way in which the European culture, the second wave of people who colonized this place, has affected, folks have looked at the changing patterns of biodiversity by doing backcasting. Where are the things today, and where are they thriving? And then if we think about that historic Willamette Valley of our grandparents, our great-great-grandparents, what was it like then? The bird that came out as the one that's lost the most of its habitat, that is most tied to the structural complexity of these big old oak trees, is the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch. So that's the bird I put really big in that swarm of biodiversity. Folks at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Washington Department Natural Resources, they all identified this bird as the single best surrogate or representative of a healthy oak ecosystem that still has most of its complexity. And so we're working on trying to understand that specific thing, sort of this bird as an indicator of all kinds of other diversity. If you see this bird here, white-breasted nuthatch, in our area, it's this special nuthatch, the slender-billed variety. Some people did some molecular genetics. I didn't do it, but they are proposing that this will be recognized as a full species sometime soon. And it lives only in the Willamette Valley and in the Puget Trough and maybe a little bit of California. So it's really a sort of essential bird. If you have an oak tree in your yard in Salem, it probably is nearby. And so really amazing. One of the things we're doing, oftentimes biodiversity begets more biodiversity, and trying to understand the relationship of these organisms to each other is a new project that folks at Willamette and broader in the Willamette Valley are interested in starting to work on. And so this picture is actually a composite of things that we know are friends of the white-breasted nuthatch and things that they might be eating on. So when you're out and about in Bush Park, if you find any animal, plant, wiggly thing, scary thing, cute thing on the tree, take a picture and share it with me. And we're going to try to put it into a food web. That claim of 500 species on the white oak is, we don't actually know that number. It could be more, it could be a little less. Folks in the East Coast have documented that the white oaks have orders of magnitude more species than any other tree in North America. This is our white oak, and provisional list, we know of at least 368 things that people have done. So we're waving our hands and saying we probably have 502. So that's one part of biodiversity. Biodiversity is important because it's beautiful. It adds more kinds of forms of life and shapes and sounds and smells. It also has many other things in which it has value. So we could talk more about that in a scientific way. But a lot of this project, I think, for all of us, for me, is sort of aesthetically driven, trying to keep all of the pieces of the puzzle, and then revealing more of them in their wonder. And I think is that me too? Okay. This project started in desperation, in a bit of, I don't know if you remember 2021, that was a tough year. We had a pandemic going on. We had a fire the fall before, we were globally known for the worst air quality in the world. And then we had this ice storm in February. I was teaching a class biodiversity climate change, and so it's about the specific intersections of racism and classism and sexism and all of the ways of oppression. And the students were like, "What are we going to do?" And I'm like, "I don't know." Karen, what are we going to do? Karen is a dendrochronologist, knows how to really evaluate the life of trees. Joe has been doing forestry for a long time, and so I sort of said, could we maybe do a project? And Karen said, well, let's see. So we did a Facebook post and got a lot of attention quick. I think a lot of people were emotionally engaged in the ice storm in their own way for many different purposes. And so a lot of fear, reasonable, a lot of sadness for trees that people had cared about, and then also wondering why it happened. And so we gathered, we made a flyer, we went around door to door and said, we are sorry your tree fell down, put it through the mailbox and said, if you'd like to share part of your tree with us, we'd like to know about the tree ring data that you'll learn more about. And in this particular event, the weather event that happened was really specific, centering on the Salem area. Didn't happen in Corvallis so much, didn't happen in Portland so much. It was definitely farther than Salem, but this is sort of a really local phenomenon, and hopefully a once-in-a-lifetime event. So we were really in a sense of salvage of the data, and then also the stories to try to find meaning in this.
So the information that Dave was just talking about, asking citizens and anybody who was interested to donate to us, went viral because one of our friends has a Facebook page with thousands and thousands of people on it, and I checked all the shares and I was like, oh, okay, this is gonna be a little bit bigger than we thought. And in the 18 months since the event, the ice storm in February 2021, the project has really blossomed into a significant community effort, engaging just, you know, regular old citizens like most of us, the city, the Oregon State Parks has helped out, and we've also engaged our students and staff at Willamette University too, so it's been pretty amazing. This slide just depicts what happens once you get a cookie, which is in the upper left corner there. So it has to be collected, usually chainsawed off a tree, and then it has to be dried, and then we have to cut it into something manageable. And I don't know if you can see on these pillars here, these long bars. That's what we changed our cookies into bars, and mounted them on wood so that we could sand them so that we could see the tree rings, and then they're basically ready for analysis. So I think probably to everybody here, tree rings are fairly intuitive, right? It's easy to count tree rings because they have this light and dark banding or patterning that makes up 1 year's growth. And that patterning consists of early wood, which is light colored. The cells are fairly large. Their cell walls aren't all that thick, so they appear light colored. And those are created in the early part of the season when the tree is growing pretty quickly. And then you have the darker banding, which is the late wood, which occurs in the later part of the growing season. And you can count those up and see how old a tree is. And if you know the year that the tree died or was cut, you can assign calendar dates to all of those rings. And that's where it gets really cool, because all of a sudden there's, you know, history, and you can connect it to things that you may know were going on in the world. In addition, as you can see from this slide, the ring widths vary. They're not all the same. I mean, maybe if you've looked at the bottom of your Christmas tree when you cut that little piece off, they all look the same. Well, that's a Christmas tree, but most trees don't grow that way. That variation in ring width actually tells us something about the environmental conditions under which the tree grew. So when you have those wide rings, it means the tree had more resources, things like light, water, space. And if the rings are narrow, the tree was probably a little bit stressed out. Maybe it was in competition with other trees for resources. Maybe there was a drought. Maybe there was an insect infestation. Or maybe somebody decided to change the land use patterns and graze animals near the trees. Maybe they became irrigated. Maybe there was soil compaction. So there's lots of cultural reasons why those rings might be wide or narrow. The other thing about tree rings that I'll mention, and you can see this as you look around at the exhibit, is there's also surprises inside those trees. Things like scars. Trees heal over scars, and you can't tell from the outside that healing has happened. We have one that is right there, the tall one, that was full of insulators, electrical insulators. It grew around those. Somebody told us about a spoon that they found in one of their trees. So there are lots of things that you can see in them. Okay, so here are the numbers for the project so far. You can see our collaborators, our community collaborators, the number of cookies that we collected, and those are both cookies from the stem of the tree as well as branches. Our oldest tree, as Matt mentioned, dates back to the mid-17th century, which is pretty exciting. And spoiler alert, it's right here in Bush Park. You can go see this, visit the stump if you want to. And we've counted over 17,000 tree rings over the past 18 months, so I think that's a pretty cool number. We've split our findings into two areas we're going to talk about. One are overall for the whole project up and down the Willamette Valley where the storm occurred, and then we're also going to talk really specifically about Bush Park. And we're going to focus on three questions. How old are the oaks? Why were oaks impacted during this ice storm? What was it that brought down so many oaks? And what other kinds of things might we be able to tell by those narrow and wide rings? And as you'll see, each time we ask and answer a question, it just leads to more questions. Okay, so just generally speaking, the range of ages for our trees was between 54 and 365 years. So we had some really young samples and these really old ones. Roughly the average age is about 130 years old. So you can see from this graph that most of the samples that we collected anyway of trees that went down established in the late 1800s and early 1900s. For each of these cookies, we also have its diameter in addition to its age. And the basic assumption about the relationship between age and diameter is that the bigger the diameter, right, or the bigger the circumference of the tree, the older the tree, right? That just makes sense. And we wanted to see if how well those two things correlated, because if we can get a really good relationship to them, then we can use that relationship to get a sense of how old the trees are that are still standing in the park, so we could identify some of the really old trees. So we graphed our data, and they actually tell us that the diameter of Oregon white oak is in fact not a good predictor of the age of the oak trees. We have some very large trees that are very young, and we have some very small trees that are pretty old. And we think that there's probably two reasons for this. The first one has to do with the conditions under which the tree has grown, and I've showed two samples up here. The one on the top is 120 years old, and the one on the bottom is also 120 years old, and these are mounted on the pillars if you want to touch them later. We invite you to do that. And what you can see is that they just grew at really different rates, right? The one on the bottom, the rings are much wider. It was putting on a lot more wood and growing larger over the same time period as the other one. And in fact, the one on the top was growing in and among other oak trees and competing with it and became overtopped. Whereas the one on the bottom was at the very top of the derby track here in the park, and it was growing out in the open and didn't have any competition, so it was able to grow a lot faster.
Okay. Here we go.
The other reason has to do with something that we couldn't have learned unless all these trees had fallen down and we got cross sections of them. And that is that some of the very, very large oaks are comprised of multiple stems. And this photo is actually right here if you want to take a look at it. And you can see at least three stems or centers on this. From the outside, these trees have what we like to call a broccoli shape, with this large trunk that seems to branch very early on. That's actually those three stems growing together for a while and then growing out as major branches. And they're usually found in open grown areas. I think that picture is from the lower part of Bush Park near the fields. Some people are really disappointed to learn that their very large oak actually isn't really, really old. It's always kind of hard news to tell people because the assumption is, oh, the tree guy told me it was 400 years old. But we want to assure you that having a large tree, even if it's not old, is really great for biological diversity, right? That complex architecture that you can see in this photograph is very, very important for providing habitat for all those species that Dave was talking about. So we can't judge a tree's value based on its age, although it is really cool to have an old tree. And just, let's see. Just to share with you our obsession with vegetables. The trees that just have one stem we call asparagus trees. Actually mark that down. Okay, so Joe's going to talk a little bit about our second question about why these oaks went down during the storm.
So I teach forest management, and so issues of forest health and why trees fail sometimes is really something that I'm very interested in. And so when we look back on the storm of 2021, and we saw all these oaks go down, and a lot of us, our hearts really were torn because of all these trees going down. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is it's not necessarily the case that the Oregon white oak was singled out, right? As we know, actually, throughout the town, approximately about 21,000 trees came down. The percentage of those that were oak, we actually don't know. We don't have comparative data between those. I think anecdotally, it might be safe to say, actually, that the oaks, for various reasons, were probably, as a percentage, probably less. I think there's some reasons to believe that there are some things and conditions within the oaks that make them actually a little bit more resilient to some of these storms, ice storms and those sort of load-bearing conditions. But when we start thinking about the various factors, we immediately start to realize that there was no one single factor that led to the failure of these oaks, or any of the trees for that matter. That it was usually a collection of factors that probably led to the failure of those oaks. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these later, but it could be the slope that the tree was on. It might have been leaning. It might have been an imbalance in terms of the canopy. It could have been in waterlogged soils because of an irrigation history. It could have been in compacted soils, something that I'll talk about a little bit later. There could have been previous damage or wounds on the trees that maybe led then to certain types of fungus being prevalent maybe in the stem or on the roots that would have then perhaps weakened the structure of the tree. So it's really hard to say at this point in terms of was there a single factor. In each case, it was probably several of these factors that contributed to it. But one of the things I want us to keep in mind is that Oregon white oak is specifically adapted to this locale, right? It co-evolved in this valley, and it co-evolved with the humans that were in this community. And so it's really well adapted. And as we think about climate change in the future, this tree is really going to be one that we're going to be relying on. One of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit later is actually, even in death, the importance of these trees. And we tend to actually underestimate the value of these trees after their death, right? For all the other things that they continue to do at that time. Kind of switching to our focus now to Bush Park, we were really lucky to be able to have such a good partnership with the City of Salem and the city parks, and to work with Brian in terms of actually collecting some of the oaks that came down here in the park. When we think about the damage to the oaks in the park, it was predominantly in the upper southwest corner. We were able to collect 15 samples with the help of the City of Salem. Approximately 15 to 20 trees came down throughout the park. There was more damaged trees throughout. And one of the things that Karen already alluded to is the age of some of these trees. When we look at the Bush Park trees compared to the ages of our overall samples, the three oldest trees out of all of our samples were from Bush Park. The next oldest samples were actually from a small rural property right on the rural suburban divide in South Salem that also were quite old, and about 300 years old. It is really quite interesting that some of the oldest trees were right here in the park. And I think I turn it back over to you now.
So when I was talking before about narrow rings and wide rings and how they might tell us something about the environmental growing conditions, I wanted to share with you one thing that I was kind of specifically looking for in these oaks. And if you can see this. I hope you could see that there's ring width variation there. That the tree was growing not really fast, but not really slow early on. And then around 1930, post-1930, the rings got really, really narrow. Any guesses as to why that might be? Dust Bowl drought of the 30s, most likely, yeah. And that had probably a long-term effect on these trees, and probably at the same time that canopy was closing. And then just after 1960, that tree starts growing like crazy, right? See those really wide rings after 1960? Any idea? Maybe history buffs, Salem history buffs in here, have any idea what might have driven that change?
The other tree.
Big storm that knocked down.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Columbus Day storm.
Yeah. Right, so that Columbus Day storm in 1962, and there was actually another storm in 1958 before it that wasn't as dramatic as the 62 storm. So here's a picture from the state capitol that shows some of the damage there. And so we can in an individual tree, we can kind of try to see if we can find some stories to tell, right, about these narrow and wide rings. The other thing, as a dendrochronologist, that we do is we'll take those ring widths from a number of trees in the same area and average them to see if there's some kind of common signal driving the width of the rings. And there we go. So we did this for the Bush Park samples that Joe was just talking about, and this is the graph that we get. And what you're looking at here is the jagged black line is actually, it's an indexed ring width. Any of the growth above the horizontal black line is above average, and any growth below that is below average growth, right? So average growth would be found along that line. And that red line is just a nice smooth version of the jagged line, which is a little easier to look at. The gray area back there tells how many samples resulted in that particular line. And we only had 3 samples that went back prior to 1850. We had very few samples. So statistics tells us that's not enough samples to actually try to interpret the data prior to 1950, but we do have this big jump in samples after that. And so kind of as a little thought experiment, I took some cultural things that I knew were going on here at this site and overlaid them on that ring width index to see if there was any story we could tell, any relationship. So here is when Salem was founded, just to kind of orient you. And then in 1851, we have the Leslie donation land claim, in which where we are sitting right now was started to become Bush's Pasture Park. And the land was cleared for an orchard. And you can see a real spike in growth there, which might not initially make sense. You might think land clearing would damage the oaks, but this probably actually meant a bunch of oaks were removed, and the ones that were left actually grew pretty quickly. And then we've got the 100 acres on this western side that was purchased and grazed and farmed from 1860 to 1946. And there's again that fast growth at the beginning of that, which may be related to land clearing, establishment of new trees, and then kind of a closing of the canopy or continued removal resulting in a decrease. And then I just put the establishment of the actual park by the city and activities, mapped that onto there. And you can see kind of like, sort of a smooth rolling change in growth, right, over time. So not as dramatic as before, yeah.
Just a question. Would the nutrients found in the cattle, the manures and stuff, have any effect? Would that make them?
That's a good question. Joe, do you know the
just
answer to
A
that?
lot of extra nitrogen or not?
Well, I'm assuming it probably,
Helped a little?
yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, what-
Yeah.
the multi-stem trees too more often, then they would start with a single stem, get browse.
Yeah, yeah, that damage from grazing is probably, yeah. So this is kind of what dendrochronologists do with all of these tree rings. So continuing on with Bush Park, Joe?
Again, moving down to kind of thinking a little bit more specifically about some of the reasons why we saw some failures of the trees here in Bush Park. I have, in the fall of 2021, I had one of my forest management classes come out here and we were doing some small site studies. And we particularly, with regards to forest health and tree failure, we spent some time looking particularly at this area kind of down here below the Crooked House playground and next to Derby Hill, where we had a number of the trees that came down there. And they did both kind of a qualitative and quantitative study. And just to give us some of the results here, one of the most interesting things that they found here was actually a significant difference in soil compaction around the trees that failed versus those that did not fail. 60 pounds per square inch difference when measured with a panometer. And that's pretty significant, right? That's essentially the equivalent of 2 trucks sitting on the property or around those roots. And so this is something that we know has been a problem in the park, right? Particularly with some of the events there. That area down there has been heavily used and it's heavily compacted soil in some of those areas. So that was a major area or a major concern in that area that came through. Also, we saw significant evidence of 2 different types of fungal infections that there are a lot of types of fungal infections. Some of them are actually very beneficial, but 2 that we know where they're more a parasitic relationship is actually the armorillia, which is, you can kind of see here, comes out in little tiny buttons, and then oftentimes they come out in these kind of big fans right around the base of the trees. And this is usually a sign of a root rot. And actually when the trees fail, particularly if it pulls when the tree fails all the way over, you will actually find these sort of mycelial fans, white streaks that are actually in the roots of this. And that's actually part of the armorillia. The other one that was found down in that area was also this Ganoderma, which is actually a stem rot. And that's usually a sign that there's been damage somewhere in the stem. It can often be the case that a branch fell or a branch broke, or there's a crook and there's water that entrains, and then that allows the Ganoderma to get actually started, and it causes the tree to rot from the interior out, and then you get a stem failure for that. And so at the sort of small site level, we were able to see that there were some reasons why some of these trees failed. One of the things that we've been interested in with my classes is, if I pulled it all up, is some of the ecosystem services that these trees provide. And again, kind of focusing on a small site study in the same area, kind of focusing on where 3 of our samples were, and then some associated trees with that, is we started to calculate the ecosystem service values that are in there. And one of the things that you should note here is that total ecosystem value per year is really pretty low, right? It might be something that we kind of dismiss. Oh, it's only $58 per year. When we look over the lives of these trees, is that we actually see that those ecosystem values are a little bit more significant, right? It figures out to about $12,000 per tree. Now that might still be a little low, but when we actually start looking at those services, this is where the kind of our eyes should open a little bit wider, right? When we looked at those trees, and this is a study of 7 trees. Those 7 trees are processing on site 105,000 gallons of water per year, right? That's an awful lot. They're transpiring water back into the atmosphere. They're storing water in their stem. They're preventing that water from entering in as runoff in rain events. When we look at pollutants, as we see that they are sequestering some really serious pollutants, right, including ground level ozone, particulate matter, and volatile organic compounds. About 70 pounds per tree, or 70 pounds total, right, about 10 pounds per tree. And then when we look at oxygen, they're producing a significant amount of oxygen. And then with regards to carbon dioxide, something that we're all really concerned about, each one of those stems was sequestering about 100 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. Right? So just one way that we can kind of change the way that we think about trees is finding a way to calculate these sort of ecosystem services, and in some cases trying to associate a monetary value with them. At the end, I'm going to talk about why that might not necessarily be the only way that we want to think about them.
Great. This is David Leslie's house. We heard about David Leslie earlier, and this is the, this house no longer exists. Bush Pasture House is built in the same place. So this is the first data, qualitative and quantitative, we have for oak trees in the park. And you can see in the growth form, it's not quite as good as Carolyn's, but you can tell that those are oaks, right? And so one of the things that many people want to know is how many oaks are in the park, and like how have things changed over time. Through a combination of support from Willamette University, external grant, and a very generous anonymous donor, I worked this last summer to count the trees in the park and to start asking some of these intersecting cultural and natural history questions. So here are the earliest photos we have of the Bush House. One of the unique things about this space we are right now, and then Joe and Karen both mentioned in different ways, it's a really special place because we've had these trees that are almost 400 years old. The reason that we can find them there is that there's been a long cultural legacy of one generation passing this place on to the next, very explicitly for general good, either of a particular family or for the city. This is uncommon anywhere, particularly in a colonized place like this. The Bush family was wealthy, and so they had cameras, and so we have early kinds of photo documentation. Many people use this park, and so we want to go and, starting with these two photos, collect as many kinds of ephemeral data. I was talking with Carolyn about her reference photos, get all of these things together and sort of put together how much has the park changed. In the same way that Karen can explicitly go and look at the tree rings, we can maybe do some backcasting, 20 years, 50 years, maybe even a couple hundred years. So you can see some neat changes there. You can see that we've added many ornamental trees. One of the big shockers to us, we expected to find these, let's say these 4 trees here, that we would go find them and they'd be much bigger. None of those trees exist. None of these trees are apparently existing either. They're all gone. That being said, there are some very big oak trees in that space. They haven't fallen down, and they're probably in that 130, 140 years. So that's kind of a neat local site thing. If you go through the park today, there have been at least 3 different efforts of other people before us tagging trees. The city has had an interest twice, and then Karen has had a student in the past go and tag trees for different reasons. We made an effort to be comprehensive, so every single tree has been tagged or except for there was a whole bunch of poison oak in one spot, we haven't finished those. And then we are also looking at many other forms of the tree's health and biodiversity. And there's a class in which we are really interested in oak galls, these big, huge forms that are made by wasps and a whole bunch of things that live in there. So we did many kinds of counts of the general shape, size, diameter of the tree, and then some of its key biodiversity. And of course, if it had a slender belt by crested nuthatch. And then here's what the data look like. It's really messy. You can't tell. We have each tree geo-referenced, and we did 1,134 trees. There's probably about maybe somewhere between 40 to 80 more trees. 286 of those trees were larger than 24 inches DBH, which is the city's threshold for a significant oak. That's kind of an interesting finding. So many of the trees in the park don't meet the 24-inch significance. And many of those trees in this space here, there's lots of small trees. I can't wait for one of those to fall down and see how old they are. I bet you many of those are over 100 years old. They're less than 24 inches, but they're over 100. I'm certain that that will be the case. And then we have 64 oaks that are greater than 35 inches, which is sort of a measure that other ecologists have said that's a massive tree, that's an important tree. What this helps us do in the future, hopefully we won't have another ice storm, But as these sentinel trees, these legacy trees, these witness trees go down, we'll know, oh no, we have 63, 62, 61. And that will go and help us, I think, understand the biodiversity, of course, but also the cultural value of those particular trees. And then also we can hopefully use this as a model of a really great neighborhood for people, birds, and trees, and then maybe grow this project up into the larger community for documenting trees of significance, lots of different kinds of significance.
One of the things that we hope that you'll take away from both the presentation here and maybe from the exhibit is there's one panel over here that talks a little bit about engagement with stewardship at the individual level and at the City of Salem level, but then also what we can do as a community. And as Matt was kind of pointing out earlier, there's a lot that's going on right here at the park. The City of Salem has really started to think differently about the way that they're going to manage the oaks here. It's impacted the way that they hold events here, right? Like the Salem Art Fair. We're not out underneath the oaks anymore because we're trying to keep that soil compaction from happening. But there's many other things that are going on in the City of Salem too. The City of Salem has several initiatives with regards to actually trying to improve canopy cover across the city. Probably maybe in some of your neighborhoods, but particularly in a lot of neighborhoods that are traditionally underrepresented, both politically and economically, but actually in terms of tree canopy, right? Because we actually know from studies throughout the Pacific Northwest and across the United States that communities of color and neighborhoods of color are the ones that actually have the least trees, right? And so the City of Salem is recognizing this and actually trying to increase that cover. The City of Salem is also working with a couple of other partners to try to find other ways to manage trees and to expand the canopy cover more generally across the area. So I hope that you might get involved. If you are a owner of trees yourself, or maybe you have some property, we really hope that you will maybe think about some of the things that you might do to manage those trees so that they can live long lives, right? Increase the amount of ecosystem services that they provide, including the habitat they can provide as well. But I just want to leave you with one last thing here, and that's this. Right? This is something that I'm spending a lot more time trying to inculcate with my students as well, is we often think about the value of a tree as somehow reaching its point, right, as it gets big, right, and then we have a storm event come along and, oh, that tree doesn't serve any purpose anymore, right? But ecologically, that tree is just starting a completely new life. Right? A new life of value, tremendous value, right? That trees after death continue to do so much for us. They continue to sequester carbon, they continue to store water and act as huge sponges. They continue to provide habitats and are hosts for all sorts of species and lots of beneficial fungi. And finally, they also continue to serve as a nutrient source. So one of the things that I really want you to be thinking about is how we might, as a community, find ways to allow more trees to continue to serve us even after their death, right? There are places that we're doing this a little bit out in Minnow Island. We could possibly do it in the bottom part of the park. For those of us that are landowners, this might be a little bit more difficult, right? In production forestry, actually, they're doing a lot of this these days, right? They've been, in one sense, kind of forced to, but it's also becoming much more common there. And I'll turn it over to Karen now.
Well, I just get to invite Joe and Dave to join me up here for some questions. How much time do we have for the questions? 5 or 10 minutes, maybe? Yeah, or not, or there's wine. That's where I'm heading next.
I wanted to amplify one of the things that Joe was talking about in other cultures that appreciate oaks, which is every single culture that has oaks. It's the most common national tree. It has more songs about it. It's just really, really appreciated. Those places in like England, the history of Cornwall, they cherish their old trees and they make them into monuments. And they have these projects. It's happening in British Columbia now at the northern end of the range, where they keep the trunks and they say, this is where Joe Bowersox gave his last lecture, or this is where George Washington ate their lunch, and this is where the king, this treaty was signed. If you look at the Basque country, they have taken one of their trunks and surrounded it with Doric columns, because this is the place that they go and they engage their government from one time to another. So we're a very young culture in the Northwest, very just shallow in terms of our traditions, but again, I'm hoping that idea that Joe has there, like, let's go and figure out different ways to keep these things around sometimes, because it really could mean a lot.
Robin,
How much impact did the Missoula floods have on the Willamette Valley pre-colonization?
That's a great question. So for those who don't know, the Missoula flood is in that period of time at the end of the Pleistocene. So the 18,000 years mark was when we set up our story. But the story of this place is, of course, much longer. And so there was this periods of great ice dams in where today Missoula is. These large lakes would form, the dam would break, and the Willamette Valley was formed, and building up of soils through a number of these floods. People were probably in there sometime. We don't know how long the West has been people. It keeps going back farther and farther. And so your question is impossible to answer, Rob. Very good. One that I share, but currently don't have a lot of information about that. But awesome to speculate.
The one thing I guess I would say to that too is that the Missoula floods, I think they've, the highest one went to about 670 feet above present sea levels here in the valley, right? So you can start thinking about that. There's a lot of places here in the valley, I mean, even here in the South Salem Hills, West Salem Hills, that were above that area, right? So there were these little isolates, and actually when you start looking at, you know, we have LiDAR data now and a lot of really sensitive remotely sensed data, and there are places where you can actually see what would have been the coastline, right? And so there were these areas that survived these higher areas where, you know, imagine you were one of these, someone who was in the valley there and you just happened to be up there.
The other thing I'll add is the history of the oaks in our valley is 18,000 years. And if you go, the farther south you go, the more oaks you get. So by the time you get to the Central Valley, you've got like, you can have a place that has like 9 species of oak in one spot. You also have more birds, more biodiversity. So these oaks are really racing as fast as oaks can, expanding their range as the ice left. And so so the Oregon white oak is the winner. It's the black oaks way back there, blue oaks still stuck near San Francisco. And so these white oaks are going north with birds being carrying the acorns. And so this is why we have only one oak, and that the assemblage of biodiversity we have with it is a subset of what's farther south in California. And that makes it all the more precious and interesting. And also it's a better signal for big kind of climate change things that we're experiencing now, as our climate becomes more like the Central Valley, and you know, we need, so yeah.
so we had a question here and then front row. Go ahead.
I'm wondering if there's anything about the root structure of the white oak that is distinct from structures of, say, the conifers, fir, Douglas fir, and so forth. And Pioneer Cemetery, we had several uprootings of the trees even before the February storm. And we were puzzled as to whether this was an indication of overwatering, over-irrigation, or something else.
White oaks tend to have a very shallow root system, and when you combine that with a clay soil, and if the soil gets really waterlogged, it's kind of a recipe for a tip over for that tree. Yeah, now I don't know if you want to add about the root diseases.
Yeah, I mean, they are really susceptible. You know, they are really susceptible to when they get starved, right? Through soil compaction, waterlogging, it's going to lead to a lot of decay. I mean, there's always going to be some of that decay, right? It's natural, but it's exacerbated when they are overwatered in the soil compaction. And because of, the weight of the trees, particularly those oaks, is so much up in their mast, right? And their mast is maybe distributed over a broader area as compared to a conifer species, right, that is straight up and down. And so as that root system starts to decay, and when these trees fail, you can actually see that the root systems that are, the effective root system is much smaller and not as wide as where the branches are, which they should be.
In terms of the records, but we can then be provoked to think about it differently.
Yeah.
That space does have a really big, one of our colleagues, Scott Pike, helped me see that there's a big fossil or left behind river, and there's huge amounts of really deep drainage. And so I think those trees could be 300 or 400 years old, but very tiny, because it's such great drainage. And the squirrels, the ground squirrels, that's where they have all their hangouts, right? It stays dry through the winter because of that same space. So those are among the nerds' highest hopeful quotient trees.
How old can an oak tree grow to? How old is the natural life cycle of an ordinary white oak tree? Do we know?
400 years might be kind of, to quote Joe, it depends. On all of
I
these,
thought I was quoting you.
I mean, there's so many things that can happen, as you probably learned from this this conversation. But really old is 400 years. I don't think I've ever heard of one much older than that.
Because the signature oak tree you have there for, I mean, I've been teaching there for 10 years, saying this tree is older than 400 years old, so it has to be at least 420 years. Or, they
You want my personal opinion on that?
yeah, but they
Maybe I shouldn't do this. I think it's multi-stemmed, and I don't think it's as old as everybody thinks it. We have a couple of limbs from there. They're like roughly 100 years. Yeah. Joe, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I have one, we're moving the project in the fall, at least for my classes, into some of the rural properties where we took samples from some really, really big trees, right? I have several that are like 48 inches in diameter, right? And one of the 48-inch trees is probably right around 100 years old. But it was the rings are some of the rings are as thick as my thumb, right? So oaks can grow really quickly, right? Even if you look at this one here where we asked you to, you can see some of the places where the oaks were growing very quickly. So it's really hard to tell.
But it doesn't mean it's not a great tree.
No, it doesn't.
No, and that's where the getting excited about the small trees that are really old, and then being able to love big trees that are relatively young is sort of part of the complexity I think we're keen to have. And then why Oregon oak trees or oak trees versus like all the other wonderful trees? And again, I think it's not a competition. We love all the trees you want to love. But these trees are unique in terms of our cultural and natural history in the Willamette Valley, in this place, and certainly in Bush Park and Salem. So that allows us to connect people through time and in generations in many different ways that we couldn't do with, let's say, flowering dogwoods or what else? Lots of good trees. So, yeah.
I think we've been talking for a little bit over an hour. Oh, one more question?
Yes,
Okay, last question, and then we'll hang out and chat.
So I read someplace that through the ice ages, the worms in North America were wiped off the surface of North America, and were only reintroduced by in the Columbian Exchange. Could worms be causing a significant problem for the oaks?
You've got part of your story is right. So everywhere that the glaciers were, we lost worms. So the Willamette Valley continued to have worms because we didn't glaciate. And we used to historically have one of the world's largest worms, over a meter long or more than 3 feet. It smelled like vanilla. Last seen in the 60s. Its closest relative, the Paulus, right at the end of the glaciers, and so, but everything like Michigan, Canada, most of Alaska did lose all of the earthworms. And then the introduction of the English earthworm, the big one that most of us see, is an invasive species. In some spaces it is transforming the ecology, but it's not probably part of the story here.
Just a little side note for a comment that was made that there are no more prescribed burns. There are several agencies actually doing this on a very long-term basis. So Fish and Wildlife Service partner with the tribes of Grand Ronde and ODF and several other federal and state agencies around. So if you go to Basket Slough, a lot of the restoration is geared towards preparing for long-term burning programs. Finley has one of the longest prescribed burn fire programs in Oregon and around Eugene as well. So not necessarily pertaining here to Bush Park, but still a very active program where it's applicable.
Yeah, and to echo what Molly's saying, the tribes and those cultural geniuses who knew how to keep this place going for time immemorial, they're going to really help us bring fire back. And they have a lot of political power to go and use fire more quickly in their areas that I think we're going to learn a lot. So stay tuned for that.
So don't leave yet, because there are two more things I want to, but please welcome or thank you. So the old tree that they talked about, and we have the cookie on that first column, 365 years old, is just what do you call it? Stump. Thank you. I don't know who said
The
that.
monument.
The stump is just behind the playground. And it's been suggested to us that we figure out as a community how to preserve it somehow, how to create a monument. So we're just starting to think about that. If you have ideas, I mean, we can work with the city to put signage, build a coliseum around it, or whatever it is. But I think that's a great idea, and we could sort of preserve some of that history. And secondly, I wanted to take a moment to have you turn to the other side of the gallery. Every Monday morning for some years, over five, Carolyn Leal has walked through the park, taken photographs, and then gone home and painted these extraordinary photographic quality paintings. All of them celebrate not just oaks, but these oaks in this park. All of them are for sale, which we artists promote and want to highlight. And maybe best of all, Carolyn is right here. So we're going to be around for another 15 or 20 minutes. You can look at both sides of the gallery and talk to all four of these folks. So thanks again.